we will need better governance in organization because it is a major driver of performance. In a world that is less rules-based, we will need governance of the organization to be strong.
Welcome to Boardroom Confidential, a podcast by Sherpany where business leaders tell the stories they usually only share with their peers. Each episode, we have 3 items on the agenda: pressure, lessons, and boardroom dynamics. I'm Emily Sheffield, a communications expert, broadcaster, former newspaper editor, and board member. And I'm looking forward to sitting down with senior leaders to talk about what really goes on behind the boardroom doors when the pressure's on and the stakes are high. Joining me this week is Didier Cossin. Didier is a professor at the International Institute for Management Development, or IMD, and the founder-director of the IMD Global Board Center. He is a renowned global expert in governance and works with boards and senior leaders around the world to provide the latest thinking on best-in-class board effectiveness, dynamics, and design. He has written and spoken extensively on the subject of governance, not least in his book, High Performance Boards, Improving and Energizing Your Governance. Didier is also chairman at Pnix Group and president of the Stewardship Institute. Welcome to the podcast, Didier.
Thank you, Emily. Great pleasure to join you.
Let's start with boardroom pressure. Can you tell us about a time you've personally felt pressure in the boardroom?
So, frankly, first, Emily, right, you give my background from the academic side as well as the professional side. Reality of the game is that I work with some of the largest investors in the world, the sovereign wealth funds, some of the large pension funds, and typically we handle hundreds of billions of dollars in order to have our assets perform. And that performance is going through boards. And so pressure sometimes is totally legitimate, I would say, to have the game move, because at large, boards are not very agile, they're not very targeted, they're not very focused. And so what we're doing typically is engage the board. The question is, how are you effective in front of a threat, and a threat that has many material aspects? And so, frankly, it's how do you detach, how do you have the landscape, the view of the landscape, and figure out the potential attacks. More and more boards are on the front line. And boards are on the front line of things that are, frankly, not that far from conflicts anymore, even at board level.
Technological advances have the ability to disrupt, and AI is front of mind for many. How do you see that adding to the pressure of boards that they are under? And also, how do they react? And Anthropic's release of Mythos, how would you advise a board to react to something like that? Do they just wait until the next board meeting, which may not be for another 2-3 months? Is that something they should take an emergency call on?
You can take it from many different angles. I think the one that is the most discussed is the transformation of the labor force, etc. Let me not get into that. There are many that speak about that. The difficulty now is that most of the junior staff in accounting is replaced by AI. And it's very hard at today's date for a high-level supervisor, an audit committee of a large company, to understand the principles of what has been applied at the bottom. Somehow AI should be more transparent, but it's not. It's actually becoming more complex to understand the assumptions that have been done and have been made at the bottom. And thus, audit itself is becoming more complex. And then I want to bring back to the risk side, which you also alluded to, the cybersecurity risk with Mythos coming in and the testing that has happened there. And of course, the fantastic capabilities now in cyber breaches from sophisticated AI models. I think that's typical of something that used to be a committee discussion and is becoming a board discussion. And board ownership of risks is still weak today, meaning that people want to delegate to a committee, but more and more that doesn't work. Geopolitics, cyber, these prominent risks, and by the way, the two are linked, right? But these prominent risks, right, are actually board matters. And like all board work, it's work. It's learning about it, it's figuring out, it's developing the competencies, having some of the natural competencies, and bringing that to key decisions.
And how do you, with something quite complex like a new technology coming along and sort of cybersecurity suddenly sort of having the ability to sort of literally break a company overnight? I'm just very interested about how boards need to be educated at the moment. You may have sort of 12 people on a big board. You don't know that everyone on that board is very AI knowledgeable or understands that there's a huge geopolitical situation unfolding in the Middle East. How do you go about advising that boards need to educate themselves? Because obviously you can't do that within a 2-hour board meeting.
I mean, there is something clear. We need board renewal. You can educate so far. I'm an educator, so I love to educate, but come on, you can educate so far, right? We need people that are more attuned to AI, to geopolitics, etc., than the classical businessman used to be. At the same time, they need to have a business mind, right? I mean, nominating an ambassador there that knows everything but has never managed a business is not very effective, right? There is, the combination, right? You need the experience, but you also need the skills. So, and this experience needs to come at a certain level. And then frequency of board meetings, I think it's obvious that we have downloads now that are online, that the discussions to be productive still have to be physical in today's world. Maybe they'll evolve, but at today's date, they're still physical to be productive. But there is a lot you can do online, and there is a lot more work at large. And then there is a third and last solution, which is AI as a support to board itself. In the synthesis of external information, how, what are the big trends, how competitors are doing, how regulators are evolving, how nations are evolving, having the signals coming to the board. I think too few boards are still using AI for external information.
So we're going to move swiftly on to agenda item number 2, which is lessons, boardroom lessons. Now, you've written and spoken in the past about what you see as the 4 key areas where boards fall short. And I wonder if you can talk us through those.
It's a big world, right? Maybe I'll start with risks because we've already started talking about it, right? And the fact that it now combines with strategy. Strategy used to be a plan, but there are very few organizations that are stable enough now to have that 5-year budget, that 5-year plan in a meaningful way. Maybe it's a fine exercise of reflection, right? But we know that's not what the world holds with. And so there is a dimension of strategies that is culture, agility or resilience, right? And that combines well with risk thinking. That's why I'm learning a lot now from the investment world. By the way, from the academic side, we're even testing that, right? What kind of boards truly perform on investments? Because there, you can look at the performance very clearly, right? When you have a big corporate with plants, etc., it's a bit hard to say whether the board performs or not, right? But when you have a portfolio of 20, 30, $100 billion, right, and the board approves the investments or does the investment strategy, etc., right, the SIP&G, what we call, clearly here you can see what kind of board performs. I think there is a lot there about, that combination of opportunistic thinking with long-term orientation based on identity. And so there is something there about best in class, but at large, simply asking ourselves, have we identified the key risks, right? And do we have a strategy that is meaningful? Or are we submitting as a board to the blind spots of our management? Is very, very straightforward. I think every board needs to ask itself. I would say the third dimension of relationship board to management is also essential. As a board member, I need to watch for the CFO discomfort, right? For the CEO relationship to the chair. Who supervises the CEO-chair relationship? How well is this managed, right? And that's absolutely central. That relationship of trust, right, in a strange environment because we know very well who fires whom, right? And we know that's more and more frequent. But at the same time, right, it has to be trusted that this is for the good of the organization, which is not very common anymore. And on the fourth and last, right, do you know, Emily, what's a percentage of CFOs across the world that say their CEO has pushed them to change the numbers?
No.
A percentage of CFO, 56%, according to a latest academic study, more than 1 in 2, right?
My gosh.
And what is the percentage? As boards, we tend to rely on the external auditors. We nominate them carefully, we take the big names, we rotate them. But what is the percentage of fraud that is uncovered by external auditors? 3%. 3%. 97% of the frauds that are discovered are not discovered by external auditors. They're typically discovered by whistleblowers or by people speaking. It's a culture of psychological safety. People speaking up, right? That's what protects an organization around integrity. Let's make very clear, right? My view of the world, I've mentioned the rise of conflicts. I think implicitly in our podcast, we talk about the performance of governance. We will need better governance in organization because it is a major driver of performance. In a world that is less rules-based, we will need governance of the organization to be strong. But the third dimension that we all see and that we should be aware is the rise of conflicts of interest, the rise of corruption, the rise of lack of integrity across systems. And this is a threat to the performance of organizations. And the question is, how do you supervise that as a board?
I mean, I've had some of those experiences myself on a board where I don't think it was about a lack of integrity. It was more a wish of wanting to show the board that they were doing better. This was a charitable board.
I can see that in a philanthropic organization. I could see that coming very naturally. How do you keep the discipline somehow?
I agree with you that governance, from my experience, is the more you go into crisis, the more governance has to play a role alongside integrity. What's the biggest boardroom lesson you've personally learned during your career, perhaps tapping back into some of those issues we've just been discussing?
I would say it's very simple. Every board is different. Every problem is different. Every solution is different. And so it's never copy-paste. I think it's a bit like being a good doctor. When you want to figure out the health side, you have to have a good understanding of the individual. And we all know that, right? We have to have a good understanding of our own self to figure out our health. I think it's the same for boards. First, do you really want to improve? Because it's continuous improvement. It's never stopped, right? We can always do better. Then do you have good awareness? How do you figure that out, right? And how do you observe? How do you take the distance, right? How do you detach emotionally to figure out the problems that are there in order to truly assess how you can fix it? And every business, whether a family business, publicly listed, or state-controlled, every private equity-owned, every business will require a different board solution.
Agenda item number 3, which is boardroom dynamics. Now, you've mentioned relations between exec and non-exec teams. How do you foster good boardroom relationships? If you literally gave me 3 top priorities to establish those positive relationships.
First, we start with the chair, because the chair is the lead and typically will drive the dynamics and the culture. A great chair will foster positive dynamics. So number one, I'm very sensitive to the onboarding of the chair. I like to have the chair CEO combination. When there is a new chair, even when there is a new CEO, for them to take a couple of days together and reflect, what's my role, what's your role? It should change depending on the person. There may be a role defined on the charter, but frankly, it's very linked to the personalities as well. And simply their understanding of each other's personalities. For that, I use different things, little tools. But these are tricks of the trade. People can use other ways, right? I use the big five, what we call the NEO, in terms of psychological awareness, 5 dimensions of psychology. People can use others, but I don't make them assess. What I do is that, okay, why as a chair, as a CEO, how do you see the other one? How do you see yourself in terms of extroversion, in terms of openness to change, in terms of agreeableness, right? How do you see the other? How do you see yourself, right? And also, I like to figure out with the world we're moving in, how do you react to conflict? Are you more accommodating, or are you more collaborating, or are you more competing in your style, right? And how do you assert yourself more or less? And how do you cooperate more or less in the system? So first, working the CEO-chair relation. Then working the board dynamics is frankly having the rules of the game established. I worked with a Finnish board from Finland, a prominent organization that became actually its largest market cap at some point, where one of the board members was coming from Germany, a lady, a strong lady, and seen by the Finnish board members as highly disruptive. The style was very antagonistic. The Finns tend to be more consensual in style, right? She was very confrontational. But the chair, very sophisticated chair in terms of dynamics, realized that this required a real investment. So he organized a strategy retreat with me. It was not a strategy retreat. It was really the German ladies' retreat. It was figuring out these dynamics, but he called it a strategy retreat. He started the retreat by initiating the rules of the game. How do we express ourselves? The culture of the board. And the German person, right, actually at this point stood up and said, well, I know this is about me, and we should talk directly about it. And I thought that retreat was starting poorly, but the reality of it is that after a while of discussion, they took 2 days. After a while of discussion, she agreed that it had a culture as a board and that she needed to be respectful of the board. And the day after, when they came back in the morning, the other board members told me before the meeting, well, we think she has a point, actually. We were not hearing her point because of the behavior, but we think she has a point. And they realized that she was right, that they were actually in a dead end from the strategy side, and that they needed to revisit the whole thing. It took 2 days. So investing in the dynamics is important. That company actually transformed in strategy, and that led it to be highly successful and iconic for many organizations around the world. And so it is, taking the time around these dynamics is essential.
Didier, it's been such a pleasure hearing your story and your insights. We'd like to finish with one final question. If you could go back to your first board meeting, what would you tell yourself?
At the time, and I was quite sophisticated, I was educated by 5 Nobel Prizes in economics, etc. Right? So I had a PhD from Harvard, etc. So I was not completely stupid, right? And still at the time, I felt it was just too complex to truly understand. And I think having that awareness is very useful. Just having that awareness that somehow the world, even the organization, is too complex for us to understand. And having the humility of taking that into consideration while contributing positively. And so bringing the humility, because I think as board members, we're successful individuals. And so often, we thrive on our ego, which is a force. It's important to have that, the confidence, right? And it's a force, and it's important to have that. But combining that at the same time with a certain humility, I think, is essential in today's world.
Very good advice, and an observation I would 100% agree with. Didier Cossin, thank you so much for sharing your boardroom stories with us and giving us your time and commitment.
Wonderful. It was great to be with you, Emily.
You've been listening to Boardroom Confidential, a podcast by Sherpany. Sherpany is a leading meeting management solution designed to meet the unique needs of the board committee and executive meetings. Find out more at sherpany.com. And make sure you subscribe to the Boardroom Confidential podcast to hear more business leaders tell the stories they usually only share with their peers.